The Door by Martin Wilsey. Damn it, Swan, you said Brunswick was small and quiet. Briggs pulled her machete out of the zombie's skull, scanning in every direction. 6 bodies now littered the sidewalk in front of the Potomac Street Grill. Joshua Swan picked the map back up with his left hand from the middle of the street without resheathing his katana. The handle is loose on this machete, and we're out of duct tape. I wish I had my axe back, she whispered out of habit. Gail Briggs lowered her hood so she could see and hear better. They stood in front of the double doors of the Potomac Street Grill. Get this door open, and be quiet about it this time. Do you have to nag and complain all the time? Swan asked. He smiled as he cleaned his blade on his zombie's hoodie and slid his sword into its sheath. He folded the map perfectly and with a speed that Briggs could never believe. I like complaining, she smiled. I'm serious about the axe. We should find a hardware store. She cleaned her blade on another body, sheathed her machete, swung her AR-15 to the front and affixed a bayonet. The double doors both had windows unbroken. Swan cupped his eyes and looked inside. Looks empty, but be ready. He pulled out a crowbar and as quietly as he could, he wedged the door open. He slipped in, followed by Briggs, who was shaking her head. I'm always ready, asswipe. She pulled the door closed behind her and was surprised that it latched. You have splatter on your face again, Swan said, knowing she hated that. Damn it, she said. Clear the place first, clean up after. The dining area was dusty but organized. The tables had silverware neatly rolled inside a paper napkin. With the ease of long practice, the two of them moved through the space. They checked behind the bar. Behind the counter was next. They could see into the kitchen through a large arch over the counter. Clear, Swan said quietly. He scanned continuously with his Glock 9mm with a suppressor affixed. Clear, Briggs replied. The bathroom doors were propped open with caution wet floor signs. Clear, she whispered. Together they moved into the kitchen, one to the left and one to the right. Clear again. Neither of them reached for the walk-in fridge-freezer door handle. Briggs and Swan had made that mistake in the past. Rotten food was the best result. Zombies were the worst result. There was a closed door here next to the walk-in. Swan placed his left hand on the knob and waited. Briggs turned on a bright tactical light that was attached to her rifle. She was 2 paces back with the light fixed on the door. At her nod, Swan opened the door, quietly but fast. He knelt low in case she shot. A light came from the far end of the storeroom. It was a long, narrow room with metal storage shelves on either side. The shelves were mostly empty. Dishes were scattered and broken on the floor. Clear, he said after looking both directions and even up. Someone cleaned it out in a panic a long time ago. Briggs turned and scanned the kitchen again before she lowered the rifle and turned off its light. I'll search in here. You take the kitchen, Swan said. Don't forget, hot sauce. I need hot sauce. Briggs slung her AR-15 around to her back, but left the bayonet attached. She systematically went through all the cabinets. She started piling her finds on the counter. There were large containers of salt, pepper, sugar, and even 2 gallons of pancake syrup. She also found 6 pounds of chock-full-o'-nuts coffee, still sealed in the cans. Going table to table, she collected 11 bottles of Brenda's Booty Burner hot sauce. She hid them behind a gallon of pancake syrup just in time. Swan came out of the back room with an old cardboard box that was closed with a dozen rolls of toilet paper stacked on top. There was a box balanced on top that also fell when he set it all on the counter. He tossed the box to her. It was full of individually wrapped handy wipes. She wrapped an arm around his neck and kissed him. It only smeared a little blood onto his nose. She had 2 packets open in a flash and was scrubbing her face, moaning with pleasure. I thought you'd like that. He moved the TP from the top of the box and flipped it open. There were about 30 cans of Spam inside. Oh my God, I am suddenly so hungry, she said, smiling wide. Swan was looking over the rest of the salvage. He was pleased. Then Briggs slid aside the gallon of syrup, revealing the hot sauce. Swan began to smile as wide as she was. Cold Spam with hot sauce. He picked up one of the bottles. Remember that night in Druid Ridge Cemetery just outside of Pikesville when you got hot sauce in your—" That's when the screaming began. It was outside and louder than seemed possible. A woman was screaming. Between shrill cries, she was screaming something. Words. "What the fuck did she just say?" Briggs asked, her rifle shouldered as she moved to the window to the left of the door. She unlatched it and slid it open. The screaming got louder. "This is a recording." The screaming began again. She backed away from the window when she saw zombies in the street moving toward the sound. The screaming stopped and the voice yelled like she was calling for help, but actually was saying, "This is not real. I am drawing them into the roundhouse. I do not need help. This is a recording." And more screams. About 15 zombies shuffled by before the screaming stopped. "I think those stairs beyond the bathrooms go to the house above. Let's see if there's a window with a view," Swan said. They cleared 2 more levels quickly. It smelled musty, not like the rot of zombies for once. The east window on the 3rd floor had a view across Potomac Street to the rail yard. With binoculars, they could see that there were lights on by a huge warehouse. These included Christmas lights on the railing of a ramp that went to a single open door on the 2nd level. Briggs opened the window. "You hear that?" she said. "It's music. The Doobie Brothers, I think." "I hear a diesel generator, a big one, and something else," Swan said. The last zombie went through the door and it eventually slammed closed and the lights went out. After a few more minutes, the sound of one machine, then another was silenced. The world was quiet again. The unnerving hush descended that forced them to whisper all the time. "It will be dark in an hour. Might as well get some sleep here tonight," Briggs said. "Let's give the place one more search and then pile supplies in the kitchen up here," Swan said. Briggs nodded her head. The linen closet had a supply of sheets. They covered the windows on the front door and stacked tables in front of the doors. It wouldn't keep anyone out, but it would make a racket if they pushed their way in. They pulled metal shelves across the back door outside the storeroom. The candles were collected from the tables before they barricaded the door at the top of the stairs. They surveyed the place and came up with a way to exit in an emergency. "Nice of them to have real fire escapes," Swan whispered. They even found 10 gallons of vinegar that they could use to fill the flush tank a couple of times on one of the toilets. "Don't say it, please," Briggs said as she was closing the bathroom door. "If it's yellow, let it mellow." Swan couldn't help himself. When she got out of the bathroom, Swan didn't hear a flush. When she walked into the kitchen, she saw that Swan had a small gas grill there. He had pulled it in from the covered porch off the living room. "Miss Briggs, I am declaring 3 days of R&R." Swan flung open 3 cabinet doors and then the pantry door. They were nearly full. Swan had found them while sweeping the house. The supplies were way more than they could carry. "I say we take a week. The hot water tank is the glass line type and has about 70 gallons of water," Briggs said. They made grilled Spam steaks with canned corn and canned peas. They ate at the dining room table by candlelight with real plates and silverware. If it weren't for the blankets that covered the windows at night and handy guns on the table, it would have felt normal. They talked about lighting a fire in the fireplace, but the autumn was not cold enough to risk it. Briggs said, "We had this same conversation on the day I first met you. Remember that apartment above the funeral home in Baltimore?" "Yes," Swan chuckled. "We almost killed each other. We stayed up all night whispering and fell asleep together at daylight." "Dumbasses," Briggs said. "How did we survive that first week?" We ran. We ran a lot." Swan was making light of it. They both knew the horrors of that first month held memories and topics they'd never revisit. After dinner was cleaned up, Briggs and Swan felt safe enough and had a good bath. They had the extra water. They always called it a bucket wash. They stood in the shower with a bucket of soapy water and a bucket of clean. They scrubbed each other with washcloths and real soap that had not been available for weeks on the road. They found clean underwear, socks, and T-shirts, as well as very fashionable overlarge tracksuits. They still wore their boots, always. They would never make that mistake again either. "Be ready to run" was a mantra that had served them well. Their weapons were never far from reach. Their packs were packed with water, food, and all the supplies they could carry easily first thing, ready to grab and run at any moment. Briggs found a leather jacket that fit well enough and would allow her to keep her AR-15 on her single-point harness, handy and out of the rain. They would stay here and rest and eat the food they could not carry away. Briggs and Swan would put some of the weight back on that they had lost. They would repair their gear, mend their clothes, and try to sleep. They would rest and be quiet and read the books they found in the house. They had learned from past mistakes. They were always ready to run, and they knew there would be a time to move again. 2 nights passed quietly. They even considered briefly sleeping together instead of taking watches. They stood their usual watches. They still slept fully clothed. They made love for the first time since the hot sauce incident in the cemetery long ago. They were clean, after all, and human. "I heard something last night," Briggs said. "I wasn't sure. I didn't see anything until I went out on the balcony at first light before dawn. They're gone." "Who's gone?" Swan was puzzled. "The people in the warehouse?" "The zombies we killed in the street. The bodies are gone." It was late afternoon on the 3rd day when Swan walked into the living room where Briggs was reading The Martian by Andy Weir. She always read when she was trying to distract herself. Swan knew her well. "Look what I found." He handed her a placemat from the restaurant. It had a cartoon depiction of Brunswick. Her eyes went directly to the exaggerated Potomac Street grill. Swan pointed to a different spot on the cartoon map. "Ace Hardware is about 10 blocks from here. I need more duct tape. You still want an axe?" he asked. "Are we talking about hitting the hardware when we head out to Harper's Ferry?" she asked. "It's in the opposite direction from the railroad tracks we plan on following." "Want to hit the hardware running light and come straight back here?" Swan asked. "We've done it before. It's a risk, but if it's a gold mine at the hardware, we could carry more." He spread out the street map and compared it to the placemat. Briggs's head came up when she heard it. The diesel generator. They both grabbed their binoculars and ran upstairs. When they got to the window, the large overhead door was already going up at the roundhouse. When it reached the top, a massive dump truck pulled out, and with a great gout of black smoke from the dual stacks onto the road. The front had a V-shaped snowplow and was covered with stains. The cab had 4 men inside, and 4 more clung to the sides, 2 on each side. All healthy, heavily muscled, and well-armed. They all wore blue coveralls. "That plow is smart," Swan said. "Shamblers in the street would be no problem. They must be getting fuel from the trains in the rail yard. I've no idea how they keep the fuel from going bad." "Why don't they ride in the back? It'd be way safer," Briggs said. She knew the macho types that rode on the running boards in towns full of zombies. Violent gangs of men who preyed on the living, especially women. They would lop off heads for sport. "Holy shit," Swan said. "Look in the back." It was bones. There were a couple of 100 skulls visible. Complete skeletons were stripped clean of flesh, disassembled and piled in there. "What the fuck?" Briggs said. "They can't be eating them." 2 hours later, they heard the big generator start again. 2 minutes after that, they saw the truck return. The back was now full of cut and split firewood. Swan's placemat had a depiction of Wilson's firewood. It had cartoon mountains of cut and split firewood. The 4 men that had been riding the running boards on the way out sat on the leading edge of the dump bed with their feet on the roof of the truck. All 4 were laughing at something, even though they all had AR-15s at ready. The sun dipped behind the mountain to the west as the overhead door closed. The screaming started again. They could now tell that the screams, the voice, was coming from the PA speakers mounted on the warehouse. The lights came on, and 5 minutes later the first zombies appeared. They followed the sound up the ramp and into the warehouse. The screaming stopped when the last of them started up the ramp. The lights went out, and just before the door slammed behind the last one, it was silhouetted by firelight from somewhere within. "Briggs, you have that look," Swan said. "What are you thinking?" "They seem to be harvesting those shamblers," Briggs said as she lowered her binocs. "But why?" "Look, I don't really care. It's safer to mind our own business, stay quiet, survive." It was a mantra that Swan had said 100 times before. "But what if they aren't assholes?" Briggs said. "Do you remember what happened the last time we tried?" Swan was mad now. "You almost got raped and I killed a real person. Yes, an asshole that asked for it, but I'm talking about risk. Then we simply recon. We are better at that now." Briggs knew she would get her way. We need information, even if we never contact them. Swan was shaking his head when he looked up into her eyes. Okay, but let's hit the hardware first. She kissed him. They geared up at first light. It was a cold morning, so they wore their light recon armor, denim jackets and jeans that had been reinforced at bite points with heavy duct tape. The arms, shoulders, and body of the jackets, covered in duct tape, showed signs that needed patching. They wore leather gloves, but regretted not having more duct tape to close the seam between glove and sleeve. They carried guns and blades only. Each wore an empty backpack for any salvage goods to bring back. They checked each other to make sure their gear was securely silenced and ready. Quietly they slipped out the front door and closed it behind them. They stepped to the center of the road and proceeded in a direct line toward the hardware. In the pre-dawn light, nothing moved except them. Scanning side to side for anything unusual, Briggs pointed out a building they passed about halfway to the hardware. It was a microbrewery, but the entire front of the building was gone. The building had been gutted and any equipment that had been there was gone. Someone was really thirsty, Swan whispered. Briggs just shook her head and kept moving. They reached the hardware and all remained still. The glass was all broken in on the front of the store. It had been professionally looted. No axes, no tools, no duct tape at all remained. Damn it, Briggs cursed quietly. Swan clicked his tongue and pointed with his chin at Klein's Antiques across the street. All the glass was intact. The sun was not up yet. They moved across the street and flanked the door. The door had been kicked in, but someone had secured it closed again to the iron railing with a bungee cord. Why are there no shamblers in this town? Briggs asked before they opened it. Quit your complaining. Maybe we got lucky for once. He unhooked the door and let it swing in. It bumped into a single zombie standing directly beyond. With practiced ease, Briggs stabbed with the bayonet in and out like a snake into the old woman's eye. The corpse fell back into the room. They slipped inside and quietly closed the door. Swan positioned the cadaver to hold the door closed as they activated the tactical lights on their weapons. An old man was moving toward them down a long aisle, and Swan advanced as Briggs covered his back. His sword stabbed in and out, and the zombie fell with a crash as it knocked over a lamp and a vase. They froze as the sound echoed. There was nothing after 2 minutes. They moved without a word. The store was small but crowded with antiques. They cleared all 3 aisles and a small office before they began their search. They met back at the counter where Swan was smiling as the sun peeked in the window. Briggs placed a massive meat cleaver on the counter and an old, long, dull bayonet from World War II. No swords, damn it. Look in that umbrella stand to your right, he said. It was full of canes, golf clubs, and a single cavalry sword. Briggs lifted it out of the umbrella stand and slid it from its black leather sheath. She smiled wide. It's still sharp. I also found this under the counter. He placed a very short, sawed-off double-barrel shotgun on the counter and an old box with 23 shells still in it. Oh my, Mrs. Klein. She looked at the old woman propped up to hold the door closed. Don't you know short shotguns are illegal in Maryland? The return to the house was uneventful. Briggs spent the afternoon making a sash that held the saber securely at her hip. Swan fashioned a similar one for the sawed-off shotgun. With only 2 shots before reloading, that thing isn't worth much, Briggs said. I know, but I can save those 2 for us, Swan said, looking away. At least we can be sure. I hate it when you talk that way, she said. What if West Virginia's a bust? Swan said. The cabin sounded like a great idea when we started. I'm not so sure now. When we left, I thought all we had to do is last longer than they did. They're rotting. We didn't know that everyone had it then, Briggs said quietly. It will never be over, Swan said. There are no happy endings, Briggs said, because nothing ends. Swan looked up at that and smiled. I read it somewhere, she said, and kissed him. They moved out before dawn the next day. The plan was to climb the structure on the side that was clearly not in use and move across the roof to the high windows. From there they would be able to see inside. When they reached the windows, they were so filthy they could not see anything. They didn't open either, so they moved along until they found a single pane of glass that was missing. Swan looked in. It was a giant warehouse-sized space that had been designed for performing maintenance on trains. There were only 2 train cars in there in a space that could have held 40. One was a propane tanker and the other was a water tanker. Swan could also see 6 massive trailers with Costco on the side and a mountain of canned goods, several years' worth of food. That explained why the pantry at the house had not been looted. Swan also counted 12 Winnebagos and 3 other Airstream camper trailers. That was just what he could see from this angle. A man with wet hair was busying himself in the large area set up as a camp kitchen. He poured kibble into a trough-shaped bin as 2 German shepherds and a basset hound lumbered up. The basset was more interested in a pat on the head and an ear scratch than food. Swan strained to follow him as he carried 2 steaming cups of coffee to an area set up with 3 large sofas. An elderly man was in a wheelchair talking to a woman in a green bathrobe and her hair in a towel. She kissed the old man on the cheek and then the one that had brought her coffee before going to one of the Airstreams. "Have a look," Swan said to Briggs. While she was looking through the window, Swan noticed that the area between the roundhouse and the river had been cleared and secured with tall chain-link fences and shipping containers all the way to the river. There were goats. All the grass looked mowed. Swan was smiling and shaking his head when he saw them. There were 20 or more shamblers in the water, moving slowly through the shallow, muddy bottom. "Briggs," he said louder than he intended. "We have to warn them." Briggs followed his line of sight. "Damn it, they'll get the goats." Then they heard the voice behind them. It was a woman's voice, calm, confident, and serious. They froze. "Turn around slowly and keep your hands where we can see 'em," she said. Swan noticed the word "we." They turned slowly to see a woman squatting on her heels with a handgun trained on them. She wore military camo with a tactical vest full of magazines, flashlights, and even a walkie-talkie, the professional kind. Her hair was dark and cropped super short, inexpertly but practical. "Look, we'll explain later, but shamblers are coming out of the river. You have to warn them," Briggs said. "And that right there is why you are not dead and in the vats already." She stood smoothly. Into a radio she said, "I have the 2 live ones on the roof. Hold your fire, Mike." Swan looked around, just moving his eyes. "We have an overwatch post in the crane cab," she said, but didn't lower her gun. "Briggs and Swan. Yes, I know your names. You can call me Laura. So, what's your story?" "You're not worried about the zombies coming out of the river?" Briggs asked. "We've been here for a long time, since the beginning. Jeff is on the river watch right now. If you look close, the fences will bottleneck them all between those shipping containers. Jeff will spear them from above." Laura looked out to the water. "We get fewer and fewer each month. We're down to running 1 vat. "That?" "Look, we are not here to hurt anyone," Briggs said. "I know." Laura holstered her gun. "You ain't got that look on you." She shifted her radio. "Mike, relax. I'm taking our guests to see Brain." "Brain?" Swan asked. "It's a joke," she snickered. "His name is actually Brian, but we call him Brain, like in that movie Escape from New York, because he showed us how to make the gas. Diesel, actually. Biodiesel. Don't call it gas, for God's sake, not in front of Brain." With that, Laura turned her back on them and began walking toward the access door. "You're crazy, you know that, right?" Briggs said. "You didn't disarm us or search us or even know if there are any others with us." Without turning around, she said, "We've been watching you for days." She stopped and turned back to Briggs. "You are the crazy ones." To Swan, she said, "You know she falls asleep on watch every night?" "I do not," Briggs protested. "And you should draw the damn curtains on the 2nd floor when you get frisky. I'm never going to hear the end of it from Mike." She went down the stairs, knowing Briggs was blushing. "I know the walkers can't see in from the street on the 2nd level, but damn." The stairs led to a catwalk in the rafters that wound around the entire enormous space of the roundhouse. At the opposite end, they could see 3 men and a woman in blue coveralls tending a fire below a giant vat. The vat was full of dark liquid, and in it they could see bodies moving. "Sorry about the smell up here," Laura said absently as they began to descend to the warehouse floor. "We keep the operation at that end. Excellent ventilation." Briggs looked at Swan and made their personal sign for "what the fuck." By the time they crossed over to the living spaces, the old man was parked at the end of the large conference table. There were 4 guards stationed around the area in tactical vests with new-looking Scar military rifles. "Briggs, Swan," Laura said. "This is Brain. He's driving this bus." "Oh, stop that." He held out his hand. "I'm Brian Mitchell. These kids let me think I'm in charge around here. They do all the work. All I do is read books." He used to be the librarian for Brunswick. He retired the week before all this started. "He's the one that showed us how to make biodiesel out of them," Laura said. 2 birds, 1 stone kind of deal. "I was wondering how you had a truck that still ran," Swan said. "All the fuel went bad last spring." Everyone's radios clicked. "Help me." Over the radio, Mike said urgently, "Jeff fell off the roof of the shipping container. No clear shot from Overwatch." Laura ran for the door. "You 4 stay here and guard the children." Running after Laura, Briggs said, "You have children here?" They crashed out the door, out of the warehouse toward the pen made of shipping containers. A 7-foot-tall wall had been erected between shipping containers. There was a ladder leaning there, tied to another on the other side. Laura was up and over the wall without missing a beat. Briggs and Swan were right behind her. Jeff was dragging himself towards them as Laura stopped to help him. Briggs and Swan passed them and set upon the horde of muddy shamblers with practiced ease. Katana and Saber danced as Briggs laughed out loud. The space was perfect for the 2 of them to have enough room. Their blades never stopped moving, creating a swirling area around them. Hands seemed to fall off as if by magic, followed by heads. The battle line advanced as Briggs and Swan ran out of targets and moved seamlessly ahead. Briggs chanced to glance back to see Jeff was halfway up the ladder, hands helping from above. Laura stared in awe at their dance. Briggs stopped laughing as the task became less fun and more like work. The last 2 heads flew off in synchronized arcs. "Your estimate was low. I counted 55, Swan said conversationally, only slightly out of breath. They both held their hand up to Laura as she approached. "Stop," Swan and Briggs said in unison. "Gotta clean up." Swan stabbed a severed head that was still snapping its jaw. "I really like the new saber, sweetie," Briggs said with exaggerated casualness. "Balance is way better than the machete." "Sweetie again, is it?" he said. "Don't embarrass me in front of the neighbors." They finished off the last of the zombies and helped carry Jeff back to the warehouse. 2 of the men guarding Brain were named John, and both happened to be EMTs. One of the Winnebagos had been set up as a clinic. Jeff had dislocated his knee and broken 3 fingers on his right hand. When Swan and Briggs stepped out of the RV, there were about 30 people assembled. They silently parted as Briggs, Swan, and the 2 Johns carried Jeff to the sofa right next to Brain. When they returned, fresh coffee was handed all around. There were even 6 children there now. All were silent. Solemnly, Brain spoke to them. "You're invited to join us. You must be weary to come so far and to become so skilled." Brain had a tone of sadness. "We'll help you tow an Airstream over from RV World if you decide to stay. But there's one thing you must do first, if you want to join us." They both nodded without even looking at each other. "First, the door," Brain said flatly. The big diesel generator started. Lights came on above them. In bright yellow spray paint was written, "The Door." The recorded screaming over the loudspeaker began. Together, Swan and Briggs realized it was Laura's voice. They opened the door. A rope was tied to the crash bar so they could close it remotely. Zombies were already coming that way. Swan and Briggs moved along a walkway just inside, where it wound around to the edge just above the empty vat on the level below. A rail and a 4x4 crossed the edge to a makeshift catwalk made of scaffolding on the far side. There was a light directly above them. The vat below was darkness. They were the bait. When the first zombie shuffled in the door, they waved their arms and called out, "Hey, over here!" They came to them, at them, with hunger in their clouded eyes, horrible wounds in their flesh. They were moths to a flame. As each one fell into the vat reaching for them, Briggs and Swan said, "Thank you. We're sorry this happened to you." Swan was crying as they fell. One was a little girl. There were only 6 by the time Briggs closed the door by pulling the rope. Swan used a spear and brought the second death to the little girl, and then to all but 2 as requested. The strongest, largest men floated in the vat of rainwater, continually moving but unable to climb out. They joined the others at the sofas. It was movie night. It always was after the door. Microwaves had been working while the generator was on, making a ton of popcorn. Battery banks recharged. Tonight was The Big Lebowski. It would be projected on the king-sized sheet they hung as a screen. Biodiesel, eh? Swan said. But why leave two, undead? Briggs asked. Laura smiled as she helped Jeff get comfortable before the movie. Making biodiesel, you have to stir it in the early stages as you boil it down. They're good agitators. That's kind of creepy, Swan said. Want to know what's creepy? Laura asked as she reclined under Jeff's arm. What? Briggs and Swan said in unison. Watching the two of you dancing through those walkers, she said. Jeff chimed in. You were both smiling the whole time. Yep, kind of creepy, Laura said, but in a good way. This has been The Door by Martin Wilsey, a Whispers of the Apoc short story. Narrated by David McCord. Audio and print copyright by Tannhauser Press, all rights reserved.